Hello, subscribers and others. David Hoffman, filmmaker. And you're about to see a short film about fear made for high school kids on how they can get over fear. But it's from the 1950s. I had a lot of fears when I was growing up. Very rough environment I grew up in. And this film helped me. Why did it help me? Well, it involves psychology. It involves being kind to children, explaining to children, showing them examples. Well, for many of you today, you say, well, so what? Isn't that how kids are being raised? Truth be told, it was not how kids were being raised at that time. In my town, I can specifically remember witnessing friends where something happened, a friend fell over, started to cry, and the father says, if you don't stop crying, I'll give you something to cry about. I can remember that phrase. I can hear that phrase. The cruelty of it. The feeling that a kid should not be afraid, and if you're afraid, you shouldn't show it, especially if you're a boy. Well, I don't agree with that. I didn't agree with that then, and this film doesn't either. Take a look and see, would it work on you or the children you have or the children you had? Is this an interesting moment in the evolution of psychology, of child psychology?
What is it, Billy? Why aren't you in bed? What's wrong, Billy? Is something the matter?
Mother...
Yes?
Is it all right if I leave the lights on just for tonight?
Oh, is that what's been bothering you?
I thought I saw someone in the room, and I heard noises.
Well, noises always seem louder at night, and then we often imagine all sorts of things that aren't true. Tell me, Billy, are you often afraid like this?
Lots of nights.
Well, I'm sorry you didn't tell me about this before. You should never be ashamed of telling me when you're afraid of something. Fear is nothing to be ashamed of. Everybody's afraid of something or other. It's very natural. Do you remember what happened a few weeks ago, that Sunday morning? I was making breakfast. You and Dad were waiting so you could get outside to work on the lawn. Do you remember how the bacon fat poured over the stove and caught fire? I was terribly frightened. Your father was frightened, too. Then he remembered an old trick about putting out grease fires, and he quickly smothered the flames. We were all frightened of the fire. It was natural. Being afraid was nature's way of warning us that the fire was dangerous and might harm us. Sometimes we're afraid of big things, and sometimes we're afraid of very little ones. But you shouldn't be ashamed of being afraid of something dangerous. No matter whether it's big or little, being afraid is nature's way of reminding us that we should do something to avoid the danger and to avoid being harmed. Do you remember the time you threw the ball onto the ledge at school? Danny was angry at you for throwing the ball out of bounds and insisted that you get it down. He dared you to climb up the wall on the drain pipe. But it looked too dangerous to you, and you were afraid of losing your grip and falling. So you refused to climb up, even if it was a dare. And the janitor got the ball for you. You see, being afraid of climbing up the wall was your warning that it was very dangerous. But now there's something else about fear that I don't think you quite understand, Billy.
What's that?
Well, sometimes when you become afraid, there isn't anything that's really dangerous. Sometimes you think things are dangerous when they're not. Sometimes you and most other people grow afraid even when they know there's nothing dangerous. Can you think of anything like that, Billy?
I know. Kathy Lewis used to be afraid of dogs, even when they were friendly. She was so scared she'd cross the street when she saw one.
Well, that's a good example of exactly what I mean.
I found it out one day when I was playing with Scrappy. You know, Mr. Rogers' dog? He's friendly. He wouldn't even hurt a flea. I didn't know she was so fraidy, Cat. I called her to come over, but she wouldn't do it. She wouldn't come back even when I told her the dog wouldn't hurt her. She didn't have to be afraid of the dog. It wouldn't have hurt her. Isn't that what you mean, Mom?
That's just what I mean. And you remember how afraid Keith Hogan was about learning to swim?
That's right. He was scared to go near the water.
Yes. Keith was afraid of something that wouldn't hurt him, too. And there's another kind of being afraid when there's no real danger. That's being afraid of what people might think, especially your parents. Do you remember a few months ago when Mrs. Campbell phoned me after dinner? Frank hadn't been seen since school. They were waiting dinner for him, and poor Mrs. Campbell didn't know what to think. Well, you know what happened. They found Frank down in the basement. His report card had some bad grades on it, and he was afraid of what his mother and father would think. Maybe even that they'd stop loving him. Of course, he found out that he shouldn't have been afraid, that his parents would go on loving him no matter what grades he made. So you can see what I mean when I say there was no real danger there. There are many things that people are afraid of when there's really no danger. Things like fear of being laughed at because their clothes are different or because their marks aren't as good as they might be. They're afraid for all sorts of foolish reasons.
But suppose you are afraid of something, like dogs or the dark. What can you do about it?
Well, each time you're afraid, try to understand whether there's really something to be afraid of. If you're afraid when there's real danger, you can learn ways of protecting yourself. There's another thing you can do to help yourself get over a fear when there's no real danger, and that's to talk about your fear with somebody.
Like we're doing now.
That's right. You could talk it over with your parents, friends, your teacher, your doctor, someone you're fond of and trust. If Frank had only talked with his mother and father about his fear that they might stop loving him if his report card wasn't good, it would have been better for them all. Of course, his parents didn't realize he felt that way. Perhaps they expected too much of Frank. And it may sound funny, but Frank's grades were bad partly because of his fear of his parents. He was afraid he couldn't make good. Talking it over certainly made a big difference to the Campbells. It helped all of them understand each other better. As they talked over his work and work habits and what they expected of him, Frank got over his fear of making poor grades and of not doing well enough to please his father and mother. He's doing much better in school now, isn't he?
Yeah. Gee, Mom, it does help a lot to talk things over.
Billy, would you like to talk about some of the things that you're afraid of? Like why you don't like the room dark?
Well, I'm lonesome. And I'm afraid you and Dad aren't downstairs. That maybe you've gone away.
You have my word that we'll never go away without telling you. And of course we'd never leave you alone. Either we or someone else will always be where you can call. How about it? Ready for sleep now?
Yeah, I guess so.
All right, darling. Good night. What about the light, Billy?
Tell you what, Mom. Leave the door open a little instead, will you?
That's fair enough. Good night, son.